I still remember the year my tomatoes embarrassed me. I had been gardening for decades by then. I'd read the books, watched the shows, followed the advice. I bought the fancy seedlings, mixed in the expensive fertilizers, watered faithfully every morning like clockwork. And yet, there they were, spindly vines, pale leaves, fruit the size of golf balls when I was dreaming of something closer to softballs. I'd stand at the edge of the garden in the early evening, hands on my hips, staring at them the way you look at an old friend who just won't tell you what's wrong. That summer was hot and dry, the kind that makes the soil crack open like it's sighing. Every time I watered, the ground drank it up instantly, as if it never touched the roots at all. I blamed the weather at first, then the seeds, then myself. I wondered if age had finally caught up with me, if my green thumb had quietly dulled without my noticing. One afternoon, I wandered down the street to talk with an older neighbor, older than me, which always felt like a small comfort. His garden was legendary. People slowed their cars just to look at it. And there they were, tomato plants thick as bushes, dark green, heavy with fruit that pulled the vines downward like they were carrying secrets too good to keep. I asked him what fertilizer he used. He laughed. Not a loud laugh, just a gentle one, the kind that says you're asking the wrong question. Fertilizer isn't the problem, he said. Roots are. That single word stuck with me. Roots. I realized then how much of gardening we do by looking only at what's above the soil. Leaves, flowers, fruit. We judge success by what we can see. But plants live their real lives underground, in a dark world we almost never visit unless something has already gone wrong. He invited me into his garden and knelt down, slowly, carefully, the way we do when we know we have to stand back up again. He brushed aside a bit of mulch and pressed his fingers into the soil. It didn't resist. It gave way softly, cool and damp, even after a scorching day. Tomatoes don't want to be fed, he said. They want to explore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about soil the way he described it, not as dirt, but as a place roots need to move through, breathe in, and settle into. I thought about my own beds, how hard they had become over the years, compacted by seasons of watering from above, by foot traffic, by good intentions layered on top of tired ground. The next morning, I went out early with a shovel and dug where one of my weakest tomato plants stood. What I found made my stomach drop. The roots were shallow, crowded, circling in on themselves like they'd hit an invisible wall and given up. Below that was dense, lifeless soil, dry 1 inch down, muddy the next, neither welcoming nor forgiving. That was the moment it clicked. No amount of fertilizer was ever going to fix this. I had been feeding the surface while starving the foundation. I had been pouring nutrients onto a system that had nowhere to hold them. The soil wasn't broken, it was exhausted. I pulled out the rest of the plants that day, all of them. It felt reckless, almost painful, like admitting failure out loud. But something in me knew this wasn't an ending. It was a reset. I spent the afternoon sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the empty bed, replaying my neighbor's words. Roots want to explore. They want depth, softness, moisture that lasts, and something living to work with. And that's when I remembered something I'd nearly thrown away that morning. A small stack of plain brown cardboard leaning against the recycling bin. It was nothing special. No branding, no gloss. Just the kind of cardboard everyone has. the kind that costs about $2 if you don't already have it lying around. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and felt a strange sense of possibility settle in. I didn't know it yet, but that humble scrap was about to change everything I thought I knew about growing tomatoes. I didn't rush it. That surprised me most of all. Years ago, I would have charged straight back into planting, eager to fix things before the season slipped away. But that evening, with the cardboard stacked neatly by the shed, I took my time. There's a certain patience that comes with age, not the forced kind, but the earned kind. The kind that knows hurrying is often what got you into trouble in the first place. The next morning, I carried a bucket of water and the cardboard out to the garden. I tore the pieces by hand, not worrying about perfect edges. I made sure there was no tape, no glossy print, nothing fancy, just plain brown cardboard, soaked until it was soft and heavy, like it had already given up being what it used to be. I dug deeper than I ever had before. That alone felt like an act of respect. I wasn't just scratching the surface anymore. I was preparing a place for roots to go somewhere new, somewhere cooler, somewhere forgiving. At the bottom of each hole, I laid a piece of that soaked cardboard flat. No ceremony, no magic words, just a quiet acknowledgement that the soil needed help holding on to what little life it still had. On top of the cardboard, I added a thin layer of compost. Not too much. I'd learned by now that more isn't always better. Then I backfilled with the native soil I'd pulled out, mixing it gently, loosening it with my hands instead of packing it down like I used to. I planted the tomatoes deeper than felt reasonable, burying most of the stem. I remembered my neighbor saying, "Give roots a reason to go down." Tomatoes, it turns out, are eager to oblige. They'll grow roots anywhere the stem touches soil, as if they've been waiting for permission all along. When I watered, I did it slowly. I didn't flood the bed. I let the water soak in, watched how it behaved. Something was different already. The water didn't rush away like it usually did. It lingered. The soil darkened and stayed dark. Then I stepped back and waited. That was the hardest part. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening where I couldn't see it. Below the surface, that cardboard was beginning its quiet work. It wasn't feeding the plants directly, it was feeding the soil itself, giving microbes something gentle to break down, something steady. As it softened and disappeared, it created pockets of air and moisture, little corridors where roots could travel instead of stopping short and turning back. A week passed, then two. The first thing I noticed wasn't the fruit, it was the color. The leaves deepened into a darker green, the kind that looks calm instead of desperate. The plants stopped wilting in the afternoon heat. Even on hot days, they held themselves differently, upright, confident, as if they trusted the ground beneath them to take care of the rest. I pressed my fingers into the soil one afternoon, half expecting disappointment. Instead, they sank in easily, cool, damp, alive. I smiled to myself, feeling a little foolish for how long it had taken me to learn this lesson. You see, the $2 secret isn't really about cardboard. It's about giving the soil a chance to remember what it used to be. Cardboard breaks down slowly, unlike kitchen scraps that can heat up or steal nitrogen while they decompose. It becomes humus over time, dark, crumbly, rich. Earthworms find it irresistible, and where worms go, everything improves. They tunnel, They mix, they leave behind castings that roots can actually use. By mid-season, my tomatoes looked nothing like the ones I'd pulled out weeks earlier. The vines were thick now, almost woody. Flowers set fruit instead of dropping. The tomatoes themselves began to swell, not in a rushed, watery way, but slowly, steadily, as if they knew there was no need to hurry. Neighbors started asking questions. "What are you feeding those things?" they'd call out. I'd smile and shrug. "Mostly patience," I'd say. But inside, I knew the truth. For the first time in years, I hadn't tried to force growth from the top. I had built something underneath and let the plants do what they've always known how to do: reach down, spread out, and grow strong where it matters most. And as the first heavy tomatoes began to pull the vines toward the ground, I realized this wasn't just a gardening trick. It was a reminder. Foundations matter. Quiet work matters, and sometimes the smallest, cheapest changes, done with care, make the biggest difference of all. By the time August settled in, the garden had changed its posture. That's the only way I know how to describe it. It no longer looked like something struggling to survive the season. It looked grounded, certain. The vines had thickened so much that tying them felt unnecessary. They held themselves. When I brushed past them, they didn't tremble. They stood. And then the tomatoes came in earnest. Not all at once. Not in a rush. One morning, I noticed a fruit that had doubled in size almost overnight, round and heavy in my palm when I lifted it gently. A few days later, another, then another. Soon the vines were bending, not from weakness, but from abundance. I added supports, not to rescue the plants, but to honor the weight they were carrying. The funny thing is, I didn't change my routine. I didn't add new fertilizers or special feeds. I didn't water more often. In fact, I watered less. The soil held on to moisture now, cool beneath the mulch, even after days of heat. When it rained, it didn't puddle or run off. When it didn't rain, the plants didn't panic. That's when I understood what had really happened. The cardboard was long gone by then, broken down and absorbed into the soil like it had always belonged there. But what it left behind was everything. A living sponge underground, space, structure. A place for roots to go deep instead of sideways, to stretch instead of circle, to breathe instead of suffocate. I pulled one tomato off the vine and brought it inside, setting it on the counter like a prize. It was warm from the sun, skin tight and glossy, heavier than it looked. When I sliced it open, the juice ran freely, seeds suspended in rich red flesh. The smell alone told a story. This was a tomato that had been allowed to grow at its own pace. I took a bite and laughed out loud, not because it was surprising, but because it felt familiar. This was the taste I remembered from years ago, before I tried to outsmart the soil, before I forgot that nature works best when we stop interrupting it. Neighbors stop by more often now. Some asked questions, some just admired. I showed them the plants, the soil, the simplicity of it all. Most were shocked when I told them what I'd done. "Cardboard?" they'd say. "That's it? That's it." The truth is, the $2 secret no one tells you isn't about tomatoes either. It's about slowing down long enough to build the foundation instead of chasing quick results. It's about realizing that growth doesn't come from force. It comes from support. As gardeners, especially those of us who've lived long enough to know better, we understand this lesson in our bones. Strong things aren't rushed. They're rooted. They're given room. They're allowed to develop strength where no one is watching. When the season finally wound down and the last tomatoes came in, so many I had to give them away, I stood in the garden one evening and pressed my hand into the soil again. It pressed back, soft and alive. I thought about how close I'd come to giving up that year, how easily I might have blamed myself, my age, the weather, or luck. Instead, all it took was listening to the soil, to a neighbor, to a quiet truth I'd forgotten. Build below, and the rest will follow. That lesson stayed with me long after the vines were pulled and the beds put to rest. And every year since, when I lay that first piece of cardboard down beneath a tomato plant, I smile, knowing I'm not just planting for a harvest, but restoring something deeper. Because the biggest growth always happens underground first.